Super Nintendo games that don't look like Super Nintendo games. That's the aim of this video, games that don't seem to quite belong on the system. I did this recently with the NES, so let's try its super sibling, starting with Wolfenstein. And yes, this is one of those games that no matter how I pronounce the name, someone in the comments won't like it. So I'm sure the correct pronunciation in Transylvanian Saxon is closer to Wolfenstein or whatever, but I'm sorry if I don't get it quite right. But back to the topic at hand, why does this not look like a Super NES game? Well, mainly because it's a first-person shooter, isn't it? And that in itself is a bit weird for the Super NES. It's not a colourful platform game, nor a top-down RPG. It's not very Mario Kart either. If it's anything, it's a bit MS-DOS. That's where this game came from, isn't it? Yes, a game made famous on the PC, and this port was done by the game's original creators, id Software. Apparently they subcontracted this version out to start with, but whoever they got in to do it ghosted them with no game in sight, so they had to do it themselves. Now, the original PC version was notable for bringing a fast-paced, texture-mapped 3D game to a platform that was really not made for it. This was made possible by a technique called raycasting, which projects a 2D map layout into quite a convincing-looking 3D world. For every column of pixels on the screen, an imaginary ray is cast out from the viewpoint of the player, and whatever wall this hits first is what is drawn. The closer the wall is, the larger it's drawn, with the texture warped to the appropriate angle to account for perspective. A quite efficient way to deal with one of the tough problems in 3D graphics: visible surface determination, what can actually be seen from a particular viewpoint. To a human, it's totally intuitive that closer objects hide ones that are further away, but it's not so easy to turn that into an efficient algorithm. The trouble is, as id programmer John Carmack found, efficient as this algorithm is, the Super NES still isn't fast enough to do raycasting at a playable frame rate. On a 16MHz 32-bit 286 processor this works, but processing power was never the Super NES's strong suit. Even compared to other 16-bit systems, it was pretty weak. He needed to come up with something else if they were going to make the fast-approaching deadline that they faced, and instead hit on what is called binary space partitioning to draw Wolfenstein's world. Instead of determining what wall to draw purely on the fly, all of the game's maps have a binary partition tree calculated for them. A sort of map of the map that lets the game's code determine what wall is visible from where with a lot fewer calculations. It ends up looking very similar to raycasting because the walls are still drawn in horizontal strips with the texture warped to match, but it's a lot more efficient. Even with this method though, the Super NES is still going to struggle. It lacks the memory bandwidth to be constantly updating the display. Even if you can do the calculations, you can't move the graphics data around fast enough to have a decent frame rate. What do? Well, make it lower resolution. Fewer pixels should make everything easier, but this also means a smaller screen size though, a common feature of first-person shooter games on low-spec systems. But luckily the Super NES has a way around that, thanks to Mode 7. That's the Super Nintendo's famous trick, the one that made games like Mario Kart possible, its built-in background scaling and rotation. Here there's definitely no rotation, but there is scaling. The 112 by 80 pixel display blown up with Mode 7 to more or less fill the screen. Yes, this game has a lower resolution than an Atari Lynx game, and without the Mode 7 trick would have to have about the same visible screen size too. This is actually not such a bad game. It runs pretty decently at 15 frames per second, thanks to the insane optimizations of John Carmack. Yes, there's a reason he has this reputation as a coding genius. Sadly, Nintendo insisted on all Nazi imagery being removed from this version, even getting rid of the original German voice samples, totally boulderizing the whole thing. Not that I'm really into swastikas or anything, but it does make it much less authentic. Even with that, this is still a far better version of Wolfenstein than you'd really have any right to expect on the Super NES. And interestingly, this version of Wolfenstein also ended up playing a sort of important role in the whole history of video games, thanks to its influence on this next game. Another one from id Software, what else could it be? Let's take a look at Doom. Wolf set the scene, but Doom catapulted the first-person shooter to the forefront of video games. Huge, enormous, there's not enough adjectives to describe how massive this game was in the 90s. Still a surprise though to see it on the Super NES. If it struggled with Wolfenstein, how on earth could it manage this? Well, the Super FX chip is the answer, a powerful processor built into the cartridge to enhance the Super Nintendo's performance. But that might just confound things even further, because this doesn't look like your typical Super FX game, does it? Not that there were many, but Star Fox and its decades-delayed sequel are a long way from this. It's all done in a totally different way though, not the best version of Doom, but it's not terrible either. Doom-capable PCs were really cripplingly expensive back then, and the Super NES version might have been the best you could hope for, but hey, you could even play online with the X-band modem. According to video game lore though, Doom did take some cues from the Super NES version of Wolfenstein. Every version of it, not just this Super NES port. Wolfenstein has a much simpler geometry than Doom. Everything aligns rigidly to a grid for a start, reducing the amount of calculations that need to be done. Doom, though, is much more complex, with stairs, multi-floor levels, and many other features, and the id team realised during development that a Wolfenstein-style raycasting engine wouldn't cut it, either in terms of performance or features. The solution was binary space partitioning once again, the thing that saved Wolf on the Super NES. This is, it seems, the true story. According to well-attested sources online, the lessons learned from a low-spec Wolf port made Doom work on the PC, but, well, what about the Super Nintendo version that we're looking at here? Well, this port was done pretty much single-handedly by coder Randy Linden, using the more powerful version of the Super FX, the Super FX2. Not like a modern GPU really at all, which are extremely specialised for graphics processing, but a general-purpose CPU that can be programmed for whatever, including the binary space partitioning-based rendering of Doom. Written from the ground up, especially for the Super NES, this wasn't like most versions of Doom a port of the existing Doom engine, but especially tuned for the system, including an optimised renderer. It still meant lower resolution and lower frame rates though, because it doesn't matter how well you optimise things, the Super FX chip has a big bottleneck getting graphics data to the Super NES's main graphics chip, where the data is turned into a TV signal. That said, the 10 frames per second of this version could probably be improved upon. According to Randy himself, there is a more efficient way of getting the data in there than what he used. It doesn't make use of the Mode 7 trick that Wolfenstein uses, but it is a lower resolution image blown up to fill more of the screen. Instead of using the Super FX chip to increase the size, the smaller version of the image could be transferred into the Super NES's video memory directly and then blown up there, which would have allowed for a higher frame rate. The full source code for this version of Doom is now available on GitHub, so if you would like to go ahead and make that optimization yourself, you now can, but as far as I can tell, no one else has yet done that. But still, immense kudos to Randy Linden. Of course, this really is a fantastic piece of work. Even the power of the Super FX is pretty weak compared to the 486 processors that this game was designed for. Wolfenstein was a surprise for the Super NES, but a playable Doom is really unexpected. But let's stay with 3D for a little while longer and take a look at a game that's surprising for the wrong reasons. Let's wade into the syrupy bog of race driving. The sequel to Atari's Hard Drivin, a second run of cutting-edge 3D graphics in the arcade, sucking up coins in a hugely elaborate cabinet. It was also inexplicably popular as a home port, despite nearly all other versions being totally explicably terrible. Yes, computers and consoles of the day weren't up to the job mostly, and the Super NES is really no exception. The main display is reduced to a tiny strip, the polygons are pared back to the absolute bare minimum, and it's still achingly slow, about 5 frames per second at best. Surely the Super NES can do better than this. Stunt Race FX is hardly buttery, but it's a racing game with similar flat shaded polygons, and it's much better, but the name is the clue. It uses the Super FX chip. That helps out a great deal, but race driving though is enhancement free and running purely on the Super NES's own hardware, and that by itself is not so good at 3D, like at all. Other 16-bit systems could do much better. The Atari ST had some quite impressively smooth 3D worlds, and in Sega Land, well, the Mega Drive version of this game isn't brilliant either, but a clear winner over its Super NES counterpart, and that's without any extra add-ons or anything in either case. Yes, this really is below par, but this polygonal 3D is a whole different thing from the raycasting or binary space partitioning of Wolfenstein and Doom. As the name suggests, these graphics are constructed out of polygons, two-dimensional shapes stitched together into 3D models in a simulated 3D environment. With these graphics you have 3 different things to worry about. Firstly, calculating the position in space of all your polygons, really a series of points or vertices linked together, how they move for each frame of animation in the game. Then you have rasterization to deal with. That is how you translate these polygons into a flat 2D image that can be displayed. And that includes how the polygons are filled, what can be seen and what's hidden, what's in view and what's not. And on top of that, you need to get the graphics data into the video RAM in the right format so it can actually be displayed. And all this requires lots of CPU time. The first 2 especially need lots of multiplication, and that is not the Super Nintendo CPU's favourite activity. In fact, it's so bad Nintendo built in special extra multiplication hardware, but even with that, it's still pretty bad. The thing that seems to take up most of the time in this game though is just copying data around, which it does an awful lot of. It takes 5 frames worth of time just to copy 1 frame's worth of graphics data into the video memory so it can be displayed, on top of everything else that has to be done. No wonder the frame rate is so low. Even the Game Boy version of race driving runs better than the Super NES one, though that was done by Argonaut Software, the British company who developed the Super FX chip and Star Fox with Nintendo, so they probably knew what they were doing. The Game Boy's CPU isn't faster than the Super NES, by the way. This version is just better optimized. Despite being developed by Atari's subsidiary Tengen, the Super NES version really is a stinker, not a high quality product at all, and it probably would be worth completely ignoring if it wasn't for this new, enormously smoother hacked version of the game that's been released recently. This really is noticeably better, created by hacker Victor Viella. This version of race driving makes use of the SA1 chip to speed things up a lot. an official enhancement chip created by Nintendo. A bit like the Super FX chip, it was included in Super NES cartridges to increase processing power. Unlike the Super FX though, which was its own thing, this is basically just the same Super NES 65C816 CPU, but around 3 times faster and with some extra features thrown in. Yeah, basically a CPU upgrade included free with games that worked in conjunction with the existing CPU. It was used in Super Mario RPG and Kirby Superstar and about 30 other games or so, though many of those were Japanese exclusives. The fact that it's the same CPU as what's already there means that it's relatively easy to port an existing Super NES game to use this upgrade. Relatively, I'm sure it's still not simple. But the use of a whole new CPU along with some other optimizations gets race driving running at a much more reasonable 20 or so frames per second. A massive improvement that could maybe have been a commercial release during the Super NES's lifetime. Okay, race driving came out in 1992 on the Super NES and the SA1 chip didn't appear till 1995, but it's not like this is making use of some all-new modern architecture, it's more or less period appropriate. But even with the streamlining effect of this new upgrade, this still isn't a very Super Nintendo-like game. It's gone from being uncharacteristically juddery to being suspiciously smooth. Super FX games usually went for higher polygon counts and more effects with lower frame rates than what this offers, so it still doesn't look quite right. It's still not an amazing game either, but it is much better for the improved frame rate. But now let's move on to a different genre altogether. Let's leave 3D behind and let's get to something that the Super NES is much more at home in and take a look at another game that's slightly anachronistic but not much. It's New Super Mario Land. A modern title released in 2019 by, I believe, a still anonymous creator. This is a remake of the Game Boy Super Mario Land for the Super NES, in the style of New Super Mario Bros. For the DS. Yeah, that really is a lot of Nintendo-y stuff all smushed into one, but it does look kind of strangely authentic, like it could almost be an official product. It really definitely isn't, of course, but some of that authenticity does come from the fact that this reuses a lot of the original assets from the DS game. On top of that, given the Super NES's resolution is actually very close to the resolution of one of the DS's screens, you end up with something that looks eerily DS-like. Quite an impressive trick given the DS came out over a decade after the Super NES. Admittedly, when you start to break it down, there's nothing here that's really new for this system, nothing you won't see in other games, but it does it all really well. Yes, the Donkey Kong Country games used pre-rendered sprites back in the 90s, and if I'd featured those games, you'd probably feel a bit shortchanged. Being so well known, they're almost the definition of a Super Nintendo game rather than something different. Lots and lots of games also use the multi-layer parallax scrolling and the transparency effects that the Super NES graphics chip allows for too. This has such a different art style though, and it turns everything up to the max so much that it all looks pleasingly not Super Nintendo-like, in a good way. This game uses the Nintendo Power Cartridge, a Japanese exclusive official flash cart, available in the later years of the Super Famicom as it was in Japan, a rewritable cartridge that let you download games at a kiosk for a fee. Nothing to do with the official magazine, by the way, just the same name, and despite that name it doesn't add any extra power to the system, just quite a bit of storage space and a battery backed up RAM for saving. There's nothing funky going on here with any kind of add-ons, this is just running on the base hardware. Maybe the new Super Mario Bros. Style has worn a bit thin. I know I was pleased that Super Mario Wonder went for something different. The new Super Mario Bros. Lasted longer than the old ones, but anyway, it's still kind of nice to see this different take on a classic. It might reuse some assets from other games, but this is really not some quick hack. It was built from the ground up as a new game, and it's even got multiplayer support. Totally up to the standard of commercial games from the classic era, and one of the best homebrew titles for a classic console ever, any platform. The anonymity of the developer makes me wonder if this isn't someone well known in some way who doesn't want their professional name associated with an unofficial product. A mystery maybe. But let's leave this aside now and make another tangential leap into something that's again both authentic and yet somewhat anachronistic. Super Road Blaster. Yes, this is also a homebrew port from 2012 by someone called D-Force, this time of the Laserdisc arcade game Road Blaster from the mid-80s, that, along with quite a few others of the era, had a bit of a revival in the CD-ROM days as full-motion video games. One of those titles like Dragon's Lair with some really great traditionally animated scenes but minimal interactivity. Just press the right button at the right time to advance the movie. Standard for the genre, but not standard at all for the Super NES, of course. Video playback was not really a thing on any cartridge-based systems back then. This is no ordinary cartridge though, or maybe even any cartridge if you want to get philosophical. This uses something called the MSU-1, a modern fantasy Super NES enhancement chip that adds a real lot of extra storage space up to 4 GB, and of course the ability to transfer that data into the Super NES's memory. That's how this works. It's streaming the video and audio from the cartridge in a way that a standard Super NES game could never do. The audio sounds great, it's CD quality, but the video doesn't look quite so good, and that's because of compression artifacts. That's not to make the video files smaller, 4 GB is plenty, but to be able to stream them into the Super NES's memory quickly enough to have a reasonable frame rate. It's the same bottleneck that affects the Super FX chip's graphics and the SA1 in Race Drivin, one that no amount of modern hardware added in can resolve really. Still, it does look quite good and maybe better than the Sega Mega CD equivalent. It's more colourful, has better resolution and a better frame rate. It might not be perfect, but you could mistake this for commercial software. Maybe a lost game for the Super Nintendo PlayStation CD add-on that never happened. Original producers Data East were certainly keen to make this game available on any platform that could handle it. They probably would have put it on the Nintendo PlayStation if it had ever existed. The MSU-1 chip, developed by sadly missed Super NES guru Nia, was supposed to be a sort of modern recreation of that Nintendo PlayStation idea, one achievable with readily available modern components. The only downside is that no real 90s era add-on would have had quite the capabilities of the MSU-1, not just the enormous storage space but also the very fast data transfer, which outpaces old school CD-ROM drives by quite a lot. You absolutely can play this game on real hardware though if you have the FX Pack Pro or SD2 SNES cartridges from Crix. They do support this. No one has ever actually made a standalone MSU-1 chip for a game cartridge though, so you won't be able to buy a repro of this or any other MSU game, of which there are quite a few. Interestingly, most of these new generation of multimedia enhanced games do tend to be, well, tickled up versions of existing Super NES games with music and cutscenes and what have you, rather than something new to the platform though. So, Super Road Blaster is doubly unusual as a Super NES game, totally not typical for the platform, but also not typical for the games that do make use of this fancy add-on that sort of exists but doesn't quite, and might have existed at one time but not quite as good. Yes, whatever, I think it's probably time to call halt to this video though, before I get totally bogged down in ontological questions I'm just not equipped to answer. Kant, Kierkegaard and even our own dear Zizek have all been oddly silent on the topic of Super Nintendo games, so philosophically I am in the dark here. So anyway, thank you as ever to my wonderful Patreons. If you would like to join in, that would be superb. It really would. Just $1 helps me out enormously. But for now, let's leave this all behind us, and I'll say goodbye and thanks for watching.